Welcome back to the deep dive. We are really glad you're here because today we are tackling a figure who is, well, honestly, she's difficult.
Oh, that's putting it mildly.
She is dense. She is intimidating. And frankly, she's one of the most essential thinkers for anyone trying to understand the 20th and I'd argue the 21st century.
I completely agree. We are looking at a woman who lived through the absolute darkest moments of modern history. The rise of the Nazis, the concentration camps, the refugee crisis, the Cold War.
All of it.
All of it. And instead of looking away or retreating into comforting platitudes, she tried to force us to stare directly into the abyss. We're talking about Hannah Arendt.
And what a life to unpack. I was reading through the massive stack of materials we have for this, the biographical records, the stacks of letters, the summaries of her dense political theory, like the origins of totalitarianism and the explosive reportage on the Eichmann trial.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that hits me immediately is the tension. It feels like her entire life was a study in contradictions.
That is the perfect place to start. She didn't just tolerate tension. She practically built her entire worldview around it. She thrived in the uncomfortable spaces between categories.
Okay, so let's just lay them out. Let's look at the hook here. We have a Jewish woman who fled Nazi Germany, narrowly escaping with her life.
Right.
Yet her most significant romantic and intellectual relationship was with Martin Heidegger, a philosopher who actually joined the Nazi Party.
And not just joined, he was an enthusiastic member for a time.
It's just mind-boggling. Then we have a lifelong Zionist who worked to save Jewish children, yet she became perhaps the harshest critic of the Zionist movement's leadership.
Absolutely scathing in some of her essays.
And finally, we have someone famously known as a philosopher. But if you called her that to her face, she'd probably snap at you.
She would. She absolutely hated the term philosopher applied to herself. She preferred political theorist.
What is the distinction there? Is that just splitting hairs? A bit of academic vanity?
No, not to her. It was fundamental. She felt that philosophy, and she's thinking all the way back to Plato dealt with man in the singular.
Man as an abstract concept.
Exactly. The solitary thinker sitting in a cave or an ivory tower, contemplating the eternal. She wasn't interested in that. She was interested in men in the plural. How we live together, how we act in the public world, how we navigate the messiness of reality.
So she wanted to be in the mud of politics, not the clouds of metaphysics.
That's it, exactly. She wanted to understand the world as it is, with people in it, not some idealized version of a single human being.
So our mission today is to get into that mud. We're going to trace her journey from a stateless refugee to one of the most controversial and influential intellectuals in New York.
And we need to unpack those heavy concepts that get thrown around at dinner parties.
Oh, yeah. Totalitarianism, the banality of evil.
The right to have rights.
We need to figure out what they actually mean and, why her books are suddenly hitting the bestseller lists again in the 2020s.
And the answer is usually because the world is starting to look a little too much like the world she described. She gave us the vocabulary to understand what happens when truth decays and when political systems turn against their own people.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. We have to set the scene because her childhood sounds like something out of a Thomas Mann novel. It's the formation of what she later called the conscious pariah.
Right. So we are in the early 1900s. She was born in 1906, specifically in Linden, near Hanover, but she really grew up in Königsberg, East Prussia.
Which is a place that doesn't really exist anymore, right? Not in the same way.
Not as it was. Today it's Kaliningrad, Russia. But back then it was the capital, East Prussia, a fortress city. And more importantly for our story, it was the home of Immanuel Kant.
Okay. The philosophical air was thick there.
It really was. It was a center of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah. And Arendt grew up in a very specific, high-minded, secular Jewish environment.
I was reading about her grandfather, Max Arendt. He sounds like the archetype of the assimilated Jew of that era, like he was a city councilman.
He was. A prominent businessman, a local politician. He belonged to a generation that believed deeply in Germanization.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant they saw themselves as German citizens of the Jewish faith. They weren't hiding their Judaism, but they believed that through culture and education, what the Germans called Bildung, they were full members of German society. They saw themselves as Germans first.
And so they would have looked down on, say, the Zionists.
Oh, absolutely. They frowned upon the Zionists initially because Zionism suggested that Jews didn't actually belong in Germany, that they needed their own state. For her grandfather's generation, that was an insult.
So she grows up in this very assimilated intellectual environment, but that security was, well, it was an illusion. And for Hannah, the security was shattered at home long before the Nazis showed up.
That's a crucial point. It's not like she had this idyllic childhood that was then ruined by politics. There was intense personal tragedy right from the start.
Her father, Paul Arendt, he was an engineer, a classic scholar.
A man who loved Greek and Latin. But his health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from syphilis.
Which, in those days, before antibiotics, that was a slow, agonizing death sentence.
Yes, involving neurological decline. He was eventually institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital and died in 1913. Hannah was only 7 years old.
That is just incredibly heavy for a 7-year-old. And there's a detail in the biography that really shook me. After he died, this little girl actually had to undergo annual medical tests for congenital syphilis herself.
Yes. For years.
I can't even imagine.
Imagine the psychological weight of that. You've just lost your father to a terrifying stigmatized disease, and now, once a year, doctors are checking to see if you are rotting from the inside, too. It instilled a deep sense of vulnerability in her.
A physical vulnerability, a sense of being tainted by fate, almost.
Exactly. All this while World War I is breaking out, and the family briefly has to flee to Berlin to escape the Russian army. It was a childhood marked by loss and instability.
But despite all that, or maybe because of it, she was intellectually ferocious. I laughed out loud at the story about her getting expelled from school. What happened there?
Slight chuckle, yes, at age 15. A teacher made an insulting remark, likely anti-Semitic, though the records vary, and she didn't just complain to the principal.
She didn't just write a letter.
No, she organized. She led a boycott of the teacher's classes. She got the other students to walk out. It's a glimpse of her future political action, you might say.
A ringleader at 15.
Exactly. She was expelled, obviously. But her mother, Martha, who was quite progressive and a social democrat, supported her. She basically said, fine, if they won't teach you here, go to Berlin.
And this wasn't just teenage rebellion. The reading she was doing was astounding. By the time she was 14, she had already read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
In the original German, in his hometown.
At 14, I was reading comic books and trying to figure out algebra at 14, which is deconstructing metaphysics.
She was precocious, to say the least. She learned ancient Greek as a child. She wrote poetry. But this upbringing also planted the seeds of her identity struggle. She grew up with this word assimilation, having a deep, almost philosophical meaning in her household.
But she starts to question it.
Deeply. She found herself identifying with a historical figure named Rahel Varnhagen.
Right. This is the woman she called her very closest woman friend, unfortunately dead 100 years now.
That's the one. Varnhagen was a 19th century Jewish socialite who hosted these famous salons in Berlin. She was brilliant, but she desperately wanted to assimilate into German aristocratic culture, and she was constantly rejected because of her Jewishness.
She wanted to be accepted.
More than anything, Arendt spent years writing a biography of her. She saw Varnhagen as a tragic mirror. She realized that trying to shed one's identity to fit in, to pretend you're not what you are, was a trap.
Varnhagen was trying to be what Arendt called a parvenu, a social climber.
Exactly, a social climber who fakes belonging. And Arendt decided to take the opposite path. She wanted to be a conscious pariah.
A conscious pariah. Break that down for us.
It means someone who accepts their outsider status. You don't hide it, you don't apologize for it, you embrace it. And you use that outsider's perspective to see the truth more clearly than the people inside the club.
So it's a position of strength, not weakness.
That's the key. She realized that if you are attacked as a Jew, you must defend yourself as a Jew. You can't say, oh, but I'm really a good German. You have to own the identity that is under fire.
That outsider perspective seems to be the key to her entire worldview. But before she fully embraces the political life, she goes to university. And this is where we get to the scandalous part of the biography.
The part everyone whispers about.
The year is 1924. She goes to Marburg, and she meets Martin Heidegger.
The hidden king of thinking, as she called him. You have to understand, Heidegger wasn't just a professor. He was mesmerizing to students.
What was so special about him?
He was teaching that thinking and being alive were one and the same, what she called passionate thinking. He was stripping away the dusty academic layers of philosophy and making it feel urgent and alive. Arendt was 18. Heidegger was 35, married, and a professor.
And they begin a secret affair.
A very intense, very secret affair. It lasted for a few years, but the intellectual bond that lasted a lifetime. He taught her how to think.
It's such a complicated legacy. Because on one hand, he's her great mentor, the love of her life in some ways. On the other hand, this is the guy who later becomes the rector of Freiburg University, and joins the Nazi Party in 1933.
He gives speeches supporting Hitler. He enforces anti-Semitic policies at the university. It's not ambiguous.
So how did she reconcile that? How do you love the mind that also embraced that horror?
It was a lifelong struggle for her. She was criticized heavily for it, and rightly so. In the 1950s, she even helped rehabilitate his reputation in the U.S.
How did she defend him?
She argued that he was a naive man who got swept up by forces he didn't understand. Her famous analogy was that he was like a peasant from the Black Forest who got lost in the big city of politics. A genius in philosophy, but a fool in worldly affairs.
That seems incredibly generous, almost willfully blind.
It is extremely generous. But for Arendt, thinking was a passion, and he was the one who ignited that passion in her. It was a debt she felt she could never fully repay, or perhaps a connection she could never fully sever.
But that passion for pure thinking had to shift from the abstract to the real very, very quickly.
It had to.
1933 comes around, Hitler becomes chancellor, the Reichstag fire happens. This is the turning point, right? This is when the pariah becomes an activist.
Absolutely. This is the moment Arendt stops being just an academic. She said that from that moment on, indifference was no longer possible. She watched as many of her intellectual friends, people who analyze philosophy and culture, started coordinating with the Nazis.
What does coordinating mean?
It was a Nazi euphemism for falling in line. They would start using the regime's language, or they'd just stay silent to save their careers. She was disgusted by it. She decided she had to do something.
And doing something meant turning her apartment in Berlin into a way station for fugitives.
Yes, a safe house. And then she takes it a step further. She gets involved with the Zionist Federation of Germany.
This is illegal work.
Highly illegal. She wasn't just organizing meetings. She was researching anti-Semitism. She was going to the Prussian State Library and collecting evidence of official government anti-Semitism, all the little ways it was creeping into daily life, to smuggle out to the foreign press. This was treason.
And she gets caught.
She was denounced by a librarian. The Gestapo arrested her. She spent 8 days in prison on Alexanderplatz.
8 days in a Gestapo prison in 1933. People disappeared for less. It sounds terrifying.
It was. But she got lucky. She describes being interrogated by a young, somewhat sympathetic officer. She had notebooks full of codes, Greek ciphers, and notes.
The work she was doing.
Exactly. She told him they were just innocent academic notes for her research on German Romanticism. She played the part of the harmless intellectual, and as she put it, she sort of fell in love with him a little bit to charm him. It worked. He let her go while awaiting trial.
But she knew she couldn't wait for that trial.
No way. The officer even hinted that she should leave. She took her mother and they fled. They escaped over the Ore Mountains by night, on foot, into Czechoslovakia.
That moment crossing the mountains in the dark, that's the boundary line. She goes from being a German citizen to being something else. A refugee. Stateless.
Exactly. And that transition brings us to the next major phase of her life and thought. The refugee experience. Because for Arendt, being a refugee wasn't just a biographical fact. It became the cornerstone of her political theory.
She ends up in Paris, right, after Prague and Geneva.
She settles in Paris in 1933, and she isn't just sitting in cafes, writing essays. She's working. She's on the ground.
What kind of work?
She is essentially a social worker and an activist. She worked for organizations like Agriculture at Artisanat and Youth Aliyah. Her job was to help Jewish youth emigrate to Palestine.
So she's arranging visas, finding clothes, organizing food.
Dealing with endless, soul-crushing bureaucracy. She described this work as dealing with real people, not just ideas. It grounded her in the practical reality of what it meant to be stateless.
And this is where she meets her second husband, Heinrich Blücher.
A crucial influence. Blücher was very, very different from Heidegger.
How so?
He was a former communist, a Spartacist. He was a street fighter, politically speaking. He'd been involved in the German Revolution after World War I. He didn't come from the high-minded German university tradition. He was self-educated and radical.
So he brought a different kind of thinking to the table.
A much more practical, historical kind of thinking. He taught Arendt to look at politics with a sharper, more realistic lens. She said he taught her how to think politically. They married in 1940.
But the war catches up to them. 1940. Germany invades France, and the French government does something that feels tragically ironic.
It's beyond ironic. They order enemy aliens to be rounded up and sent to internment camps.
Enemy aliens being the Jews who had fled Germany.
Precisely. This is where she first described refugees as a new type of human being created by contemporary history. She fled Germany to escape the Nazis, and now the French are locking her up because she's German. She was sent to Gurs, a camp in the south of France near the Pyrenees.
What was Gers like?
It was chaotic and bleak. It wasn't an extermination camp like Auschwitz, but it was a holding pen with terrible conditions, mud, disease, lack of food. But the psychological toll was worse. Arendt described the suicide wave that swept through the camp. People just felt completely abandoned by the entire world.
And then the escape.
In June 1940, France surrendered to Germany. In that window of absolute panic and chaos, the camp administration fell apart. The French guards were terrified of the approaching Germans.
So there was an opportunity.
A small one. In that chaos, Arendt managed to get liberation papers. Historians think they were likely forged or acquired through the confusion. And she walked out.
She just walked out of the camp.
She walked and hitchhiked north to Montauban, finding her husband, who had also escaped a forced march. They were fugitives in occupied France.
How did they get to America?
They eventually managed to get exit papers and visas to the United States, largely thanks to Varian Fry, the American journalist who ran a secret rescue network out of Marseille. They arrived in New York in 1941 with very little money and speaking very little English.
So she lands in New York, has to learn a new language, a new culture.
She learned English by living with a family in Massachusetts.
And all of this experience, being arrested, fleeing, being stateless, being interned, it all coalesces into one of her most famous and penetrating concepts: the right to have rights.
This is a deep dive concept we really need to sit with. She formulates this in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, but the seeds are all in her own life.
Okay, lay it out for us, because growing up, we're taught that human rights are inalienable. You have them just by virtue of being a human being.
Yeah.
The Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, they all say these rights are natural. Arendt says, not so fast.
Exactly. She says that's a beautiful idea, but it's a dangerous fiction. She looked at the experience of the stateless people, the refugees like herself. She saw that as soon as you lost your citizenship, as soon as you didn't have a government to protect you, those inalienable human rights evaporated into thin air.
So if you aren't a citizen of a specific country, there's no one to actually enforce your human rights.
Correct. Who do you call? If you're a German citizen in Germany and your rights are violated, you call the German police. But if you're a stateless person in France, and the French police are the ones rounding you up, who protects you?
There's no higher authority.
There isn't. She argued that human rights are an abstraction. In the real world, rights are only enforced by a state. When you are stripped of your political status, when you become just a human being and nothing else, you lose the protection of the law. She wrote that the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human.
The abstract nakedness of being human. That is a haunting phrase. It's like she's saying that being just a human isn't enough to be safe. You have to be a citizen of somewhere.
It isn't enough. If you are just a human, you can be put in a camp, deported, or killed, and no police force has the jurisdiction to stop it. The right to have rights, then, isn't some natural right. It is the right to belong to a political community.
The right to have a passport, basically.
The right to belong to a community where your words and actions matter, where you are judged by your actions and not just treated as a biological specimen. Without that political framework, you are vulnerable to anything.
That connects directly to her view that the nation-state, flawed as it is the only thing that actually guarantees rights. Which brings us to the book that made her famous, The Origins of Totalitarianism.
A massive, sprawling, difficult book, but it established her reputation as a major thinker. In it, she analyzed Nazism and Stalinism, not just as brutal dictatorships, but as a novel form of government.
That's the key distinction for her. Totalitarianism was something new. It wasn't just tyranny 2.0.
Right. Tyranny is old. It's as old as politics. It uses terror to crush opposition. If you oppose the king kills you. If you stay quiet and mind your own business, you're usually fine.
So the terror is targeted.
It's targeted and it has a rational goal, stay in power. But totalitarianism argues it uses terror to subjugate mass populations even when there is no opposition.
Wait, explain that. Terror without opposition. What's the point?
Think about the Stalinist purges in the late 1930s or the Nazi death camps. They weren't just killing enemies of the state who were plotting coups. They were killing people who were completely innocent, often completely loyal, or just selected at random based on some ideological category.
Like being Jewish or being a kulak.
Exactly. The goal wasn't just to stay in power. That was almost a side effect. The goal was to remake reality according to an ideology, to prove that the ideology, history is a class struggle or history is a race struggle, is the only reality, and terror is the engine that makes that happen.
And she talks about the concept of superfluous people here. making people unnecessary.
Yes. This is maybe the most chilling part of her analysis. She argues that the ultimate horror of the camps wasn't just the killing, it was the attempt to make humans superfluous or unnecessary, to destroy their individuality, their spontaneity, their ability to start something new.
How do you do that?
You do it by destroying their legal status, first making them stateless. Then you destroy their moral self by forcing them into impossible choices. And finally, you destroy their unique identity through torture and degradation until they are just a bundle of reactions, starving, marching, dying. At that point, you have destroyed their humanity before you even kill the body.
That connects back to the nakedness of being human. Totalitarianism wants to strip away the person and leave just the biological matter. And to do that, you need a population that can't distinguish truth from lies.
This is where her analysis of ideology and terror gets really, really relevant to the modern ear. She talks about how totalitarian leaders rely on a populace that is cynical and exhausted. She wrote that the ideal subject of a totalitarian regime isn't the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist.
Get someone else.
It's people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists.
Wow.
People who just assumed everyone is lying all the time.
She also mentions that if you catch a totalitarian leader in a lie, their followers don't feel betrayed. They admire the leader for being clever enough to fool everyone.
Exactly. It's the tactical cleverness they admire. Truth becomes totally irrelevant. Only consistency with the ideology matters. The Jews are responsible for everything, or the bourgeoisie are responsible for everything. Once you accept that first insane premise, everything else is just logical deduction.
It's a terrifying diagnosis of how mass movements function. It's a closed loop.
A completely sealed system of thought. And speaking of terrifying, we have to move to the event that made her a household name, and not in a good way for many people. We have to talk about the Eichmann controversy.
Okay, part 4. The year is 1961. Adolf Eichmann, the logistician of the Holocaust, the man who organized the trains to the camps.
The ultimate desk murderer.
He's captured by Israeli agents in Argentina and put on trial in Jerusalem. It's a massive global event.
The first televised trial of its kind.
And Arendt goes to cover it for The New Yorker. Now, everyone expected a monster, right? A raving anti-Semite, a demon, a Shakespearean villain.
She expected that too. She wanted to see evil incarnate. But what she found in that glass booth in Jerusalem was a bland bureaucrat. A man of outrageous stupidity, she called him.
I mean, he wasn't dumb, right? He was an incredible organizer.
Not unintelligent, no. He could manage logistics perfectly well. The stupidity she was talking about was an inability to think from the perspective of someone else. He was just empty.
And this is where she coins that incredibly famous, incredibly misunderstood phrase, the banality of evil. We need to be very, very clear about what this means.
Yes, because people get it wrong all the time. They think she was saying the crimes were banal or common or not that bad.
Which is the opposite of what she thought.
She absolutely was not saying that. The crimes were horrific, unprecedented, monstrous. What she meant was that the motives of the doer were banal, terrifyingly ordinary.
Eichmann wasn't driven by a radical, satanic will to do evil. He wasn't Iago.
Not at all. He was driven by careerism, by a desire to be a joiner, by a desire to follow the law and be a good functionary in the system. He wanted a promotion. That was his primary motivation.
She said he spoke in cliches. She called them winged words or stock phrases.
Yes, he seemingly couldn't speak without using a slogan he'd picked up from somewhere else. My honor is my loyalty. Words of the Führer are law. He had abdicated his capacity for critical thought to the party. That, to Arendt, was the scariest part.
That you don't need to be a monster to commit monstrous acts.
You just need to stop thinking. You just need to be a cog.
That observation alone would have been enough to cause a stir. But she went further. She touched the darkest chapter.
Yes, this is what caused the explosion. In her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, she discussed the role of the Jewish councils, or Judenrat.
Okay, what were these?
These were Jewish community leaders who were forced by the Nazis to administer the ghettos. They were made to make lists for deportation, to organize the ghetto police, to keep order.
An impossible situation.
A morally impossible situation. And Arendt reported on the fact that without this cooperation, the Nazis would have had a much harder time killing so many people so quickly. She argued that the collapse of morality was total, that even the victims were forced into complicity. She called it the darkest chapter of the whole story.
I can absolutely see why that would enrage people. It sounds like victim blaming.
Explosive is an understatement. The reaction was immediate and vicious. She was accused of blaming the victims. She was called a self-hating Jewess. Her old friend, the scholar Gershom Scholem, broke off relations with her in a series of incredibly bitter public letters.
What was his main criticism?
He accused her of lacking Ahabath Israel, love of the Jewish people. He said she was writing from a cold, unfeeling distance.
And how did she defend herself? Did she back down?
Never. She stood her ground. She said she was risking the truth. She felt that to understand the total moral collapse of the time, you had to look at everything, including how the victims were manipulated and implicated in the Nazi machinery.
And what did she say about this love of the Jewish people?
This is such an Arendt response. She famously replied to Scholem that she didn't love any people or collective. She said, "I have never in my life loved any people or collective. I indeed love only my friends, and the only kind of love I know of and believe in is the love of persons."
Wow. I don't love groups, I love persons. That's the core of her thinking, isn't it?
It is, but the pain she caused was real, and she lost many, many friends over it. She became a pariah all over again.
But out of this controversy comes another brilliant insight about obedience. Eichmann's entire defense was, I was just following orders. Befehl ist Befehl. I was obeying the law.
The Nuremberg defense. And Arendt just dismantled that. In a famous interview and in her writings, she argued that in politics, obedience is the wrong word.
What does she mean by that?
She said children obey their parents. In the world of adults, especially in politics, you don't obey. You support.
And that's where we get the famous quote, no one has the right to obey.
That's the one. She argued that if you are part of a bureaucratic machinery carrying out orders, you aren't a child obeying. You are an adult actively supporting that machinery. By participating, you are giving your consent to the system.
So the excuse, I was just obeying orders, is actually a confession.
It's a confession. I supported this. That framing completely changes how we look at responsibility. You can't hide behind the hierarchy. If you are there doing the work, you are supporting the outcome. It puts the burden of judgment back on the individual.
Okay, let's pivot. Because while she was dealing with all this darkness totalitarianism, Eichmann, the camps, she was also writing about the potential for light. Her book, The Human Condition, came out in 1958, before the Eichmann trial.
A masterpiece. And a complete change of pace. In this book, she tries to categorize what human beings actually do. She's asking a fundamental question. What is the active life? She breaks it down into labor, work, and action.
Okay, break those down for us. They sound like synonyms in English.
They do, but for her, the distinction is vital. Labor is what we do to survive. It's the biological process. Eating, sleeping, cleaning. It's a cycle that leaves nothing permanent behind. You wash the dishes, they get dirty, you wash them again. We are like animals in this state, just serving our bodies.
Got it. Labor is survival. What's work?
Work is what we do to build a durable world. Making tables, building houses, creating art, writing books. It has a clear beginning and a clear end, and it creates a stable, man-made environment for us to live in. It counteracts the futility of labor.
Okay, and then there's action. This is the big one for her, right?
Action is the big one. Action is the only one of the three that happens directly between people, without the intermediary of things or matter. It's politics, it's speech, it's the way we reveal who we are to one another in the public sphere. It's unpredictable.
And this brings us to her most optimistic concept, natality.
Yes. And you have to contrast this with her teacher, Heidegger. Heidegger's philosophy was obsessed with mortality. His key concept was sein zum Tode, being towards death.
Our lives are defined by the fact that we're going to die.
Right. Arendt completely flips it. She says the central fact of human existence isn't that we die, but that we are born. She focuses on birth.
And not just physical birth, right? She means something bigger.
Exactly. She means the capacity for new beginnings. She believed that because we are born into the world as new, unique creatures, we always have the capacity to start something new. We are not just products of history. We can interrupt history. We can act. The miracle that saves the world, she wrote, is the fact of natality.
That is incredibly hopeful. Even in the darkest times, we can start again. A new person, a new idea, a new action can change everything.
It's a profoundly optimistic view of human potential.
But she wasn't always on the right side of history in the eyes of her contemporaries, especially when it came to American politics. We have to talk about her essay, Reflections on Little Rock.
This is a difficult one, and it shows her blind spots, no question. So in 1957, the U.S. government sends federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce the integration of Central High School.
A landmark moment in the civil rights movement.
And Arendt writes an essay opposing it.
She opposed desegregation. That sounds shocking, coming from her.
It does. To be precise, she wasn't opposing desegregation in principle, but the method. She argued that the government was forcing children to fight a political battle that adults should be fighting. She saw the images of Elizabeth Eckford being screamed at by a mob, and she was horrified.
So her argument was about protecting children.
That was the core of it. She felt it was cruel to thrust children into a situation of political violence and social ostracism. She made a sharp distinction between three realms: the political, the social, and the private.
Okay.
In the political realm, she argued, we must all be equal before the law, so laws against interracial marriage were an abomination. But in the social and private realms, she argued, we have the right to discriminate, to choose our friends, who we invite to our house. And she saw schools as part of that social realm.
But she was criticized heavily for this, wasn't she? Because that distinction doesn't really hold up in the context of Jim Crow America.
It doesn't, and she got hammered for it. Critics, most famously the author Ralph Ellison, pointed out that she simply did not understand the American context of race. She was looking at it through a European lens.
What was she missing?
She didn't grasp that in the American South, social discrimination was enforced by political violence and law. Segregation wasn't a private choice. It was state-sponsored tyranny. She later admitted she was writing as an outsider, but she stuck to her point about protecting children.
It shows that she wasn't infallible. She was applying her philosophical categories, private, social, political, so rigidly that she maybe missed the reality on the ground.
Which is a very Arendt-Nusian problem to have. She loved her distinctions, sometimes more than the messy reality.
Let's touch on one last political concept before we get to her legacy. Lying in politics. She wrote about the Pentagon Papers in the Vietnam War.
Yes, in her essay, Lying in Politics, she analyzed how the U.S. administration had created this huge web of deception regarding the war. But again, her insight is deeper than just politicians lie.
Which isn't exactly news.
No. She noted that organized, systematic lying destroys the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world. It blurs the line between fact and fantasy.
It goes back to that idea of cynicism we talked about with totalitarianism. If you lie enough, people don't just believe the wrong thing.
They stop believing in the possibility of truth itself. And this is the quote you need to hear. The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed.
People end up believing everything and nothing.
Exactly. They think that everything is possible and that nothing is true. And that is the danger. When you lose the ground of shared reality, you can't have politics. You can't have freedom. You're just floating in a void where the loudest voice wins.
So let's talk about her personal life and legacy. We've covered her heavy ideas. But who was she as a person?
She had a genius for friendship. Despite being a loner intellectually, she didn't belong to any school of thought, and she hated cliques. She had incredibly deep friendships.
With who?
Mary McCarthy, the American novelist, was her closest friend and literary executor. Their correspondence is just beautiful, warm, funny, fiercely intellectual. She was also very close with Karl Jaspers, her old teacher from Germany. She was fiercely loyal to her friends.
And what about feminism? She was the first woman to be a full professor at Princeton in 1959. She must have been a feminist icon.
You would think so, but she actually pushed back against it. She did not identify as a feminist.
Why not?
She famously said, "I'm quite used to being a woman." She didn't want to be what she called an exception woman. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted to be judged on her work, not her gender. And again, she was suspicious of any movement that focused on a specific identity rather than the broad political world we all share.
Again, the plurality over the specific.
Yeah.
She died in 1975.
Yes, of a heart attack in her apartment in New York while entertaining friends. A very fitting end, really, surrounded by conversation. She was 69.
And she was working on something at the time.
She left her last great work, The Life of the Mind, unfinished. She had completed the sections on thinking and willing, and the first page of the third and final section on judging was found in her typewriter. Just a title page.
Judging. Wow. That feels like the missing piece. We have thinking, willing. And she was just about to tell us how to judge.
And in a way, her whole life was an exercise in teaching us how to judge without banisters, as she said. Without a preset rule book. To look at the situation in front of you, whether it's a refugee crisis or a bland bureaucrat in a glass booth, and to think for yourself and decide what is right.
So let's wrap this up. What is the ultimate impact? Why are we still talking about Hannah Arendt in 2026?
Because she diagnosed the diseases of our time better than anyone else. She warned us about loneliness and rootlessness being the preconditions for tyranny. She challenged how we think about evil, that it's not always dramatic and satanic, but often bureaucratic and thoughtless. And power. That it's not just violence, but people acting together in concert. And above all, she emphasized active citizenship. Freedom isn't just being left alone to watch TV and consume. Freedom's participating in the public world with your peers.
It's about showing up.
It's about showing up and taking responsibility for the world we all share. That's her core message.
Okay, I want to leave the listener with a final thought, something to mull over. We talked about natality, the capacity to begin again. Arendt borrowed a phrase from the poet Bertolt Brecht. Dark times. We often feel like we are in dark times.
Absolutely. But Arendt says that even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination. And that illumination doesn't come from a leader or a god or some grand theory.
Where does it come from?
It comes from us, from our actions, from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances.
And here's the provocation for you, the listener. If obedience is actually support, where in your own life are you obeying when you should be thinking? Where are you acting as a cog in a machine, assuming someone else is taking responsibility?
That is the uncomfortable question she leaves every single one of us with.
There's a visual I want to end on. In Bolzano, Italy, there's an old fascist building from Mussolini's era. It has this huge marble relief of Mussolini on horseback and the classic fascist slogan, "Believe, obey, combat."
Right.
In 2017, they didn't tear it down. They projected a new sentence over it in glowing LED lights, so it covers the old slogan. It's a quote from Hannah Arendt.
No one has the right to obey.
Reclaiming the space for critical thought. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
It was a pleasure, a difficult pleasure.
The best kind. Keep thinking. We'll see you next time.